Tēnā koutou katoa. Good day to everyone. Ko Pablo Del Monte toko ingoa. My name is Pablo Del Monte. I am one of the co-directors of the Center for Global Studies in Education, and I will be moderating this seminar. It is indeed a great pleasure to be hosting this conversation. It's connecting us across different parts of the world. It is an untimely conversation for various reasons, one of which is that it's engaging with the work of Martin Thrupp, who in various ways spoke against the times, against the current times in which he was writing and speaking. And this conversation, in a way, it's a form of continuing this legacy and this gesture. To begin with, let me acknowledge everyone's relationship to Martin Thrupp and his work here, including family, friends, colleagues, readers, co-authors, students. And let me also acknowledge the people who have supported this seminar series, and the series at the Wolf Malcolm Institute of Education, Educational Research, in the University of Waikato, and especially the Center for Global Studies in Education team, whose work have made this event possible. We have a great list of speakers who relate to Martin Thrupp's work in different ways, and who will present in an order that links to the chronology of this work in some way. I will do a very brief introduction to move without delay to the talks. The first speaker is Hugh Lauder, Professor of Education and Political Economy from the University of Bath, who will be followed by John O'Neill, Professor of Teacher Education from Massey University. Darren Powell, Associate Professor in Health and Physical Education from the University of Auckland, will speak afterwards, followed by Bronwyn Wood, Associate Professor at Victoria University of Wellington. Dr. Katrine McChesney from the University of Waikato will follow. Then Dr. Marta Estellés from the University of Waikato. Dr. Megan Smith from the University of Waikato, and finally Jade Rothel, who is a PhD candidate, also at the University of Waikato, will close the talks. We have 1 hour and a half. I hope we do have some minutes for questions after the talks. So I would like to ask you to write your questions on the chat if you want, for the speakers to respond in the end. And afterwards, I will after closing the seminar, the Zoom room will remain. I will keep it open for anyone who wants to continue to talk. And some people may leave, some may stay. But without further ado, let's begin this untimely conversation, and let me then open the floor for this first speaker, Professor Hugh Lauder. The floor is yours.
Kia ora. Thank you, Pablo, and thank you for organizing this seminar. It is an untimely seminar, but a very important one, I think, for us all to have. And I don't know all of you, but I know some of you as close friends, and I'm pleased to see you all again. I'm going to just do a bit of not great intellectual work in relation to Martin. I'm sure many others will, but just a bit about his early career, and then a bit about what he's done subsequently. Martin Thrupp was my first PhD student, and one of the most illustrious. He was a person of great determination, but also very clear about being very precise about his work. And I'll give you an example. He published a paper in the British Journal of Sociology of Education, very prestigious, when he was still a PhD student. And I said to him, "Oh, congratulations, Martin, that's just terrific." And he said, "Yeah, well, maybe, but I'm not sure." And I said, "What do you mean you're not sure?" And he said, "Well, I can see some problems with it. I can see that I should have said this and I should have said that." I said, "Martin, do you realize there are probably 10,000 PhD students in America that would give their eye teeth to get published in the British Journal of Sociology of Education? But it actually didn't make any impact on him at all. And so there you see, I think, something about Martin's self-criticism, but his determination to produce work which was of a very high quality. And that, of course, is what he did. He came to great attention over this side of the world with his first book, Schools Making a Difference, and then the provocative, Let's Be Realistic. And that then brought him great attention globally. Before that, of course, he'd also contributed to the Smithfield Project. And not long ago, I was in London at a seminar at New Zealand House when Lockwood Smith, who had been the Minister of Education in New Zealand during all those troubles that we had in the 80s with neoliberalism or the New Right, came up to me and he said, "Did you name that project of yours in New Zealand, which was on markets and education, after me?" To which I said, "No, it's a meat market in London, Smithfield." So we left on good terms, but he kind of, I think he'd got to the point where he'd had enough of me. So we then move on to Martin, having published that book, coming to England. And one of the things I'd like to say, because he then moved on to work with not only people back in New Zealand through Waikato, of course, but then in Finland. And one of the remarkable things is that when you look at Martin's research projects and you look at his publications, you see just how many people he actually worked with. And so he's in England and he's at King's College, and he phones me up and he says, "I want you to be part of a research project." So I said, "Sure. What's it on?" And he said, "Well, I want to look at the whole business of school composition, or school mix, as we used to call it, in terms of schools in England." So it was a kind of rerun of the Smithfield Project, but augmented in many different ways. And one of the ways that it was augmented was that the people that he recruited to actually be part of this project. And that project had people like Ruth Lupton in it. It had Harvey Goldstein, who was probably the leading education statistician anywhere in the world. And so we got down to actually writing the proposal. Now, this is for the Economic Social Research Council in this country. And you get about a 1 in 25, 1 in 30 chance of getting a grant from them. And in fact, we got the grant. And so we set to work. So that was a clear example of the people that he identified in that process. And then from that, 2 more brilliant PhD students, one of whom's unfortunately died. One is now a reader at the University of Bath, were encouraged to move on through with Martin and through his work. So you get that kind of thing with Martin. And then at the same time, he's writing a book, which I didn't know about, with a guy called Rob Wilmot here at Bath in the management school, which is a brilliant critique of all the kind of stuff that goes on in terms of management education, and is still, I think, one of the best pieces of work on as a critique of management that I've come across. It's just excellent. So when I went back this morning and looked through all his publications, there are 10 pages on the University of Waikato website. And what you see is also the fact that he was working with other academics, but he was also working with practitioners. So the New Zealand Principles Journal, fantastic. He was constantly in dialogue with them. He was in dialogue with policymakers in this country and in New Zealand, and indeed in Finland. And so what you see is a person of enormous energy and enormous hope, always pushing against the most difficult policies and ones that we perhaps would not be endorsing in any way at all. But he was always in there, always engaging with policymakers, not in a way which really upset them, but just making the points that he wanted to make. So really impressive in that particular way. And Pablo sent me an article, probably his last article, I think, from the New Zealand Principal about the upcoming election. And of course, we can only just wish that, given what's going on in New Zealand now with Luxon and co, he would have been throwing his hands in the air ever so nicely, of course, politely, but nevertheless making some very sharp points about what they were doing. So I'll end with this. I think that if I could imagine an academic and what it requires to be an academic in this modern day and age, I would say that the model I would consider, and the model I point to with my own PhD students now, is Martin Thrupp. Just an extraordinary academic and an extraordinary human being, and I shall miss him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Let me now invite Professor John O'Neill, whose scholarship had met with Martin Thrupp since the early days as well.
Kia ora, Pablo. Kia ora, Tato. I'm just going to share screen because I find it easier to do that. Okay, so in many ways, I'm going to pick up some of the threads of what Hugh's just said. I was thinking about Martin, as I presume we all are at the moment, and it's easiest to think of things about Martin that aren't Martin. So I remember in particular when he made his Herberson address, one of the first slides he put up was of dogs and family. And I have a long-standing memory of Martin's god-awful ties that he used to wear. So alongside all those wonderful qualities that Hugh has just mentioned, the aesthetics of Martin's life were probably one area where I would have got him to work actively on had I had the opportunity. So yes, Martin was a truly wonderful colleague. And I think one of the features that I remember most strongly, because it aligned with some of the work that I was doing, was the breadth of the activities. It was not just the quality, but it was the actual breadth of activities. So Martin has been acknowledged as a public intellectual. And throughout the time that I've known him, briefly before he went to England, but much more in depth since he came back, was his energetic engagement with groups like the Quality Public Education Coalition from the mid-1990s onwards for many years, and also his work for the Child Poverty Action Group. And those both showed, I think, his strong sense of justice, but his humour was also apparent. Some of his Waikato colleagues will no doubt remember the public performance art with a hospital bed at one stage when comments were being made about the deteriorating quality of public services. And it strikes me that shows not just Martin's deep concern with the nature of our social democracy, or our deteriorating social democracy, but also the need to engage with the public in ways that are intelligible to and appealing to the public. So Martin had various registers and could mix and match those and flow between them almost effortlessly in order to speak the language that was required when he was engaging as a public intellectual with these policies that have a superficial appeal, but as Martin knows, were also causing considerable harm in both the short and medium and the long term. The next one is certainly not a term that Martin ever used, and would cause puzzlement to some, but it seems to me that Martin, in his close relationship, not just with NZPF, but over many years with NZEI, the Primary Teachers Union, from whom he received a fellowship or a life membership, I can't remember which, and PPTA, Martin was very well aware of the need for close connections and alliances between the peak bodies that represent teachers and their work, and leaders in schools and their work, and academics. And I think he was certainly one of the more prominent figures in that field, and produced a couple of major research reports during that period. The next one is really his great interest in the practicalities of what goes on in classrooms, and I'm sure some of that is no doubt attributable to long conversations with Marika, but also Martin developed wonderful relationships with those schools and those teachers in which he conducted his empirical work. And one of the distinguishing features of Martin's sociology of education in the New Zealand context, and Noeline Alcorn has mentioned this on numerous occasions, is that he was willing to get his hands dirty in the classroom. That was also a feature of the Smithfield Project work that led to his PhD, as Hugh well knows. Those publications and those books are remarkable in their empathy with the difficulty of the craft of teaching, particularly in unhelpful policy contexts. And then lastly, as Hugh has mentioned, Martin's international networking and his international collaborations are quite staggering. So Martin's spheres of interest were genuinely global, and Darren and I were really fortunate to work with him and Pia and others internationally on the Finnish project. But as Hugh said, those international connections were developed and maintained and nurtured over many years. And for example, in the last book on standards, the contributions from other scholars to Martin's own monograph, which appear at the end of the book, are again noteworthy in terms of their international reach. So I think, you know, the legacy of Martin exists across all those spaces. And when Hugh was talking about the ideal academic, then I think the idealism extends to these spheres of interest as well. If we're not working across all of those, then we're doing less than we could be from our still very privileged positions and gazes. So looking forward over the next few years, you know, as Hugh's already acknowledged, that we're going to desperately miss Martin over the term of the current government. And some people may not have seen Erica Stanford, the Minister of Education's reported comments in the press over the last few days. But it's clear that the New Zealand initiative in particular is whispering loudly in the minister's ears. And there are people, to put it bluntly, crawling out of the woodwork in terms of seeing themselves having a chance to influence the policy agenda with a mixture of legitimate and illegitimate policies, let's just put it that way. So I think there's going to be a huge domain of struggle that Martin would be well placed to comment on. And of course, we have to pick up the torch and do it ourselves now in curriculum and assessment. There's also, in terms of this Nancy Fraser notion of parity of participation, we have a long history in New Zealand of Clayton's consultations and token participation. Looking back, the last 6 years have been perhaps a short-term period of a return to something like active participation of the unions and the profession in policy making. And I suspect that's going to disappear in favour of hand-picked ideologues who are going to influence the way that education policy develops over the next few years. Going back to Martin's interest in the craft of the classroom and the relations between teachers, learners, and whānau, I think pedagogy, again, is clearly going to be an area of struggle over the next few years, with the promise of structured literacy, structured numeracy, structured science, and structured everything. But at the end of that, we need to come back to the notion that the material conditions in which teachers work are certainly not conducive to anything like a flourishing of the profession of teaching. And then lastly, this is an area where I think Martin has possibly been cautious in commenting on, because those of us who are beneficiaries with the baby boomers, as Chloe Swarbrick would put it, that have benefited from everything, I don't think we've necessarily engaged with a critique of social democracy in the way that we necessarily should. So we still look back to that as a halcyon age, and I don't think we're really well placed to engage with the ongoing Maori Renaissance. You know, the Maori critique, the rangatiratanga developments that have taken off in a really nice way, supported by government over the last few years. And really, there's a need for renewal of our vision of social democracy. I think Martin would have been a very enthusiastic participant in that conversation and would have made some good contributions. But again, I think that's something that we're obligated to take up. Going back again to Hugh's comments, that Martin was quite clear, quite determined. He was pragmatic in the best Deweyan sense of the term about the agenda going forward. And for all those reasons, you know, I'd encourage us as a group to look after each other and to carry on that work, not least because there are so few of us left to do the work. Kia ora tata. Thanks, Pablo.
Thank you very much, John, for your words. Let me invite Associate Professor Darren Powell, who has recently worked with Martin Thrupp in various projects.
Tēnā koutou katoa. First, thanks to Pablo and the group that got this seminar together, and also thanks to John and Hugh for your words. I mean, I think you're both a tough act to follow in the best of times, but you know, given the circumstances and you know your long-standing relationship with Martin, yeah, I really appreciate what you've just spoken about and reminded us of. For me this morning, rather than trying to summarize Martin's contribution to research, you know, from my perspective, I'd like to use Martin's words from one piece of writing to illustrate his endeavour to shape scholarship, policy and practice. And to do this, I'm wanting to draw on a chapter Martin wrote in 2019 for this book, for the 6th edition of the Professional Practice of Teaching in New Zealand, which he also co-edited with Mary Hill. The chapter is entitled, excuse me, the chapter is entitled Raising Our Heads, Keeping a Critical Eye on Policy and Research. And it demonstrates why Martin believed it to be so important for teachers to approach policy and research from a critical perspective. For those that don't know this book, it's strongly evidence-based, but it's aimed at teachers, and particularly beginning teachers and student teachers. It's compulsory reading in many initial teacher education programs across the country. And Martin's contribution as both an editor and an author, for me, is a clear example of his desire for his research to make a meaningful difference to teachers, to students, to underserved communities, and to the teaching profession as a whole. And what's turned into now a bittersweet moment, I was fortunate enough to be asked by Martin to co-write a new version of this chapter for the 7th edition to be published on this year. Only 2 weeks before Martin's death, he was still emailing me, asking me how my family was, which you know, he did every time we spoke, and still wanting to review the final version. So I hope my reading of his original chapter in 2019 does justice to Martin's work. So Martin began the chapter with a Chinese quotation. They lower their heads to pull the cart instead of raising their heads to look at the road. He used this as an analogy for the way educators around the globe too often respond to educational reform. He argued that one problem facing teachers and leaders was that they're so burdened by the range of demands on them that they often just want to get on with their work rather than question where they are being led by policymakers. As John also mentioned, Martin clearly understood that teaching is busy, challenging, intensive work that often leaves teachers struggling to balance professional demands and their personal needs. Nevertheless, he was driven to illuminate the importance of teachers raising their heads to take a critical view of the educational politics in which their work is situated. And there were two parts to his argument. First was that if teachers only pull the cart, they leave themselves vulnerable to policy decisions and research claims that may not necessarily be in their best interests. And second, that a critical perspective on schooling, policy, and research was required. So why did Martin believe that teachers need to take an interest in the politics of education? There were two key reasons. One reason was that education policy may have a harmful effect on present or future cohorts of students. He stated clearly that teachers owe it to their students and families to challenge policies and practices that disadvantage certain groups of students. Second, Martin argued that teachers need to pay attention to the political context of education so they can defend themselves against unreasonable claims that they're not performing adequately, especially in a context where schools and teachers are positioned as a panacea for a myriad of social, political, and economic problems. He drew on his 2014 work on deficit thinking and the politics of blame to shed light on how perceptions of teachers, including those expressed in the media, work to prevent teachers and principals from being able to discuss how learning is being constrained by the social disadvantages experienced by their students. He also discussed here how neoliberal education policy makes teaching and learning in schools less equitable and less authentic. And he asserted that teachers need to not only be informed about education policy, but they need to be able to assess the extent to which policies are supported by research and the caliber of such research. He reminded us in this chapter that just like teaching, research is an inherently political activity, and teachers should not just accept claims of research underpinning policy without looking into the context, the assumptions, methods, and findings of the research being discussed. A point that both Hugh and John made in regards to this becoming increasingly pertinent over the next few years of education reform in Aotearoa. Importantly, Martin in this chapter didn't simply argue why teachers need to raise their heads and leave it there, but how. And he did this through contrasting problem-solving perspectives with critical perspectives. And he explains how problem-solving perspectives tend to reflect common sense, functionalist, ahistorical, individuated, and often monocultural views about the purpose of schooling, while critical perspectives draw on sociologically and politically oriented education research. To illustrate this, Martin provided concrete examples from his own and others' research on school choice, school effectiveness, evaluations of schools using targets, inspections, and of course, national standards. And finally, the dangers of relying on inspirational stories of teachers and principals turning around low socioeconomic schools. His point to teachers was in typical Martin fashion, clear, jargon-free, and to the point. He states, teachers need to look for and favour the critical over the problem-solving perspective because the latter is so inadequate. To take a problem-solving perspective will simply perpetuate the unfair and often anti-educational state affairs we currently have. In an area of research and in a context where we can often feel somewhat hopeless and pessimistic, Martin concluded with the following: keeping a critical eye on policy and research allows for a complex hope that remains optimistic, but unlike naive hope, recognizes the very real historical and structural difficulties that need to be overcome. Complex hope also allows the celebration of small victories in schools, without confusing these victories with the cause of more fundamental political and social change, or abandoning that wider goal. With this in mind, I remain hopeful and optimistic that we can continue the legacy of Martin's work, to metaphorically throw shoes at those who continue to contribute to and profit from educational inequities, inequalities, and injustices, and to ultimately raise the heads of teachers, researchers, and policymakers to look at the road. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora, Darren. Let me invite Associate Professor Bronwyn Wood to the floor.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Bronwyn Wood toku ingoa, and I'm from Victoria University here in Wellington. It's a pleasure to join you today, and thank you for Pablo and the others who have made this opportunity possible to just draw us together to take a moment to reflect on Martin's contributions. I don't think I would be overstating it to say that Professor Martin Thrupp is New Zealand's preeminent education policy researcher. In my mind, he held this status ever since I was a master's student studying school zoning in South Auckland before the millennium, when I was trying to work out why Ero was shutting down so-called failing schools. And Martin's work drew my attention to social class and the work of Bourdieu to explain this. Later, as a PhD student, I returned to look at his work, seeking deeper explanation about why students in varying socioeconomic communities in Aotearoa New Zealand experience such wildly different forms of citizenship education and opportunities for participation. In both these research experiences, Martin's acute insights into the role of social class provided more explanatory power than a host of so-called technical ideas which were presented at the time. So this brings me to the first significant contribution Martin has made for the academic field, his commitment to expose social and educational inequalities, and particularly through the lens of social class. So Martin's understanding of this goes right back to his early comparative education policy studies in the late 90s, as Hugh has referred to, between England and New Zealand, where his research highlighted the importance of social mix, or the complex mix of social, geographic, and historic factors which shape a community and a school, and which he argued were essential for understandings of policy. For example, right back in one of his earliest papers on these so-called failing schools in South Auckland in 1997, he made the acute observation that the findings of school failure can be explained by looking to the organic or interconnected relationships between schools and the middle class rather than the working class families. It is essential to understand the relations between home and school and how these play out at the school level as well as at the individual level. His observation was that rather than looking at the working class, we need to turn our attention to the middle class and how they navigated schools and policies to ensure it worked well for them. And in his 2007 paper on school policies of zoning, he concluded that New Zealand's urban middle class have always sought and been successful in finding ways to educate their children in socially advantaged schools. And the evidence from all periods of policy change also showed socially advantaged urban schools participating very enthusiastically in this project. That hasn't finished to today. So this vein of interest in social class has continued through all of his work through to his final edited book on Finland's famous education system. And he consistently pointed out how education policy has systemically ignored the interdependence of social contexts on school performance. He had critiqued much of the school effectiveness research laying into this with quite considerable gusto, which has played far too much weight, he argued, on teachers' quality and overlooking the powerful influence of home background. Some of these ideas are still not very popular today because they suggest that it takes a far more complex solution to policies than just putting a good teacher in front of the students. He has retained an ongoing commitment to understanding social policy as a sociological and political construct, and one that cannot be pulled out or isolated from context. A second focus I see in his life's work was not only on the mechanisms of policy and policy making, but a commitment to understanding how policy is enacted. And in fact, sadly, this was the topic of one of our final conversations at the end of last year, where we discussed the need for a book which explored in much greater depth how policy lands in New Zealand schools. We both believed, and we still know so little about what makes one policy effective and another fail, and in particular how this plays out in New Zealand's unique and slightly mad landscape of self-governing schools. Unless we understand how policy engages with and encounters with the complexity of the sites for which it's intended, it may as well not be written at all. This search for more complexity is a goal I've had in my education policy classes, which I teach at 300 level and at master's level. And for many years now, we've been looking at Finland, and lovely to see some Finnish people online today. That miracle country that managed to sit at the top of the international testing regimes without even doing a lot of testing in their schools. So finally this year, I had in my hands to show students this week and last week the book that Martin's published with more than 50 Finnish authors that takes the gloss off and undertakes a critical examination instead of adulation. As Martin and his colleagues state in the introduction, yet something being finished does not make it a success or failure. Indeed, the proposition of wholesale national success or failure is oversimplifying and artificial, and thus mostly uninteresting for research. Rejecting methodological nationalism, we pay more attention to schools as sociological and political phenomena. So this book takes a much more critical and interesting look at how policy is enacted and practiced in Finland, drawing attention to, for example, issues of socioeconomic disadvantage, the exclusion of Sami language and students that need profiling alongside the educational phenomenon that Finland has become. His previous work on how national standards were enacted similarly sought such contextual complexity, and also his more recent work on private actors in New Zealand schools. I also want to speak to his contribution to the scholarly community, as throughout his time, he made a significant contribution in his warmth and his commitment to others. And in recent years, I had the pleasure of being involved with Martin in several ways, and in every encounter, I was struck by his generosity of spirit, his humanity, and his deep knowledge of policy and New Zealand education. So on one occasion, I'd been asked to write an education chapter for a major New Zealand social policy book, and feeling I was a bit of a fraud to be that lead author at this national level, I immediately asked Martin Thrupp to join me with a former student of mine, Michael Barker. So I offered Martin the first author position to recognise his status in our community, but without any hesitation, he insisted that wasn't necessary and that he would like to play a supporting role for younger academics. In one encounter, I examined a PhD student of his, and shout out to Dr. Megan Smith, who's speaking later, who wrote an excellent PhD. And I appreciate his insistence that I travel to Hamilton to conduct this PhD examination, as he believed, as did I, that the relational encounter of a doctoral examination would make all the difference in the world for everyone involved. This then required him going into bat for a university that said examinations could be done online post-COVID and face-to-face was not necessary. But as the event proved, the ability to talk in far greater depth inspired a book project, which I referred to earlier, alongside new friendships, such as Megan, who continue his legacy in Waikato University, and to build that scholarly community. During this visit, Martin described with such joy that the award that had been given to him, a very rare honorary doctorate from the University of Turku in Finland, and he described how this group of colleagues he had worked with for many years awarded this, including being gifted a doctoral sword in recognition of the work he had done. He described it as one of the most rewarding experiences of his life, as he struggled through walking on a moon boot to accept that award. but just to be recognised with a commitment to a group of people he loved and that he could explore educational issues with. So in sum, Martin's passing has left a huge hole for the education policy community, as well as his whānau, his friends, his students. However, the legacy of his work will continue to shape education policy and indeed researchers for multiple years to come, as we are reminded by his avid commitment to understand inequalities and how to share an academic life with others. He will be missed, and I, for one, will make sure his work lives on. Kia ora koutou, katoa.
Kia ora, Rowan. So let me now introduce Dr. Katrina McChesney, who has worked with Martin Thrupp recently here at the University of Waikato.
Thank you, Pablo. Kia ora koutou. It's pretty special to be here and, you know, following such a sort of esteemed list of speakers. You know, what the speaking order is doing is moving from Martin's earliest days and the people who were his mentors, represented by Hugh, to his peers. And now, you know, it's coming to us more junior people. So I'm an early career scholar, 6 years in, and I've had the pleasure of working in the division with Martin and collaborating with him in a few different ways. And I want to kind of build on some of the things that Hugh and Bronwyn both talked about not so much what Martin researched or found, but who he was as a researcher and as an academic and as a colleague, the things that I have valued seeing and learning from him in terms of how we might be academics, how we might walk in this strange environment. So yeah, I've worked with him as blogging, teaching together within the department, and have had sort of learning from afar, just observing, and also times where I've gone to him with things and he's been willing to give me time and talk with me about things that I was needing to do some learning. And so as I was reflecting, I wrote this list of sort of things that stood out that I had learned from Martin. And the top one there is just that call to be better, which resonates with the complexity point that Bronwyn mentioned and others that Darren talked about, that, you know, we can't have thin thinking, we can't have easy solutions or assumptions that if we just change this one thing, we'll all live happily ever after. If we just get the curriculum right, the children will do brilliantly. Or if we make them feel culturally safe, that will be the unlocker. You know, there are many good things that are important, but Martin's work showed us how so many of those things come together and need to be considered in their interactions. And he brought that kind of call for better through all aspects of his academic work. You know, in terms of teacher education, I remember him being very clear that the reason we told students that something was a good idea or should happen in their practice could not be because the Ministry of Education says so. That was a hot button point for him. There had to be better evidence than that, and we had to be inhabiting our kind of scholarly responsibilities to critique and question, and only back things that we felt were evidence-based and warranted that support. But he didn't kind of stand back over here at the university, as others have mentioned. He was really closely engaged with the profession, trying to build that better practice. I know that the writing he did for the New Zealand Principles magazine was really important to him. It doesn't, you know, might not carry the sort of scholarly weight, but it was some of the most important work he did in his mind, because it was connecting with the people he most wanted to impact. And he had this way of sort of calling forth better and being in that critic and conscience role without being the really annoying critic and conscience that you wish would shut up because it makes you feel guilty all the time. You know, sometimes that critic and conscience role can become all about telling people that they're bad and that they're doing bad things. And I really appreciated that Martin was able to challenge thinking within the university, beyond it, within the profession, in a way that felt respectful, collegial, you know, resistant to that politics of teacher blaming, but equally still wanting to pursue better. that's terrible grammar, but I think it expresses the concept of what I think Martin was kind of calling forth. He also kind of taught me something about academic citizenship. Barbara Grant's written about this idea of 1,000 tiny universities, that we are all the university, and we construct the university through all of these micro momentary actions and decisions. And so there can be these 1,000 tiny universities, all these little ways in which we are generating the university that we want to be part of and to see. And I can see lots of those kind of moments in Martin, the way that he showed up within the division, meetings, decision-making, consultation, presentations by staff who were being considered for appointment. He was always there, always present, always engaged, not just there to be seen to be there, but critically and cognitively there, having a view, having a substantive engagement with what was being talked about, speaking up, challenging things that he felt were harmful or unreasonable. He wasn't scared to push back on things, and he was willing to be frank, probably to the point of being uncomfortable sometimes certainly for people who had to be in charge of him. But he could speak up in ways that didn't just benefit him, but protected a group, including more junior staff or precarious contract staff, in terms of things like workload and administrative support and expectations, as well as kind of constructing the university in terms of what we might expect of our students. And again, that call for better scholarship, that this should not just be a transmissive banking model of teacher education, for example, that they parrot all of the currently accepted correct ideas back to us and we give them a degree for it, but that they should be really thinking robustly and critically and defending their position and perhaps challenging our position. I'm so glad that Darren talked about that chapter, because that was something that had come through to me, that idea of raising your head to look at the road. Martin and I co-convened the first paper in our grad dip teaching programs, postgrad dip and Master of Teaching and Learning. And so every summer, several hundred shiny, new, enthusiastic student teachers would read that chapter and they'd be taken with it, and I'd read their online discussions talking about this challenge. And although it seems like quite a sort of sophisticated idea for once you've settled into the profession, actually these teachers who were about 3 weeks into their learning were captivated by this invitation and this challenge to be active, agentic, critical thinkers, attuned to complexity, feeling like they can have a voice in shaping and constructing the profession. So I guess that's taking the 1,000 tiny universities idea and bringing it into the role that teachers can have as well. And the last thing that I wrote down there was this sort of saying, to thine own self be true. I don't know that Martin ever said that to me, but it somehow summed up the way that he was highly, highly successful as a researcher, a teacher, an academic citizen, a scholar and a leader, all of the things that he was, hired to do and that make you a wonderful professor or academic. But he did them because they were important to him and in ways that were important to him, and never because of game playing or compliance or kind of external pressures. He had this level of integrity about why he would do something, and he wouldn't publish somewhere just because someone said that was necessary or the right place to publish. He would write for stuff and for the New Zealand Principles magazine and the Waikato Journal of Education and the Enzari blog. He would make these choices that reflected his values and the difference that he wanted to make in the world, reaching the people that he wanted to reach. And so I think this is a really sort of aspirational, challenging picture of how we can be an academic in, neoliberal 21st century marketised universities, where there are lots of competing ideas and pressures. I've learned a lot from watching and working alongside Martin over these 6 years, and I'm so grateful that I have had his example and the opportunities to talk with him about being an academic and doing this kind of work. Here at Waikato, we've been thinking a lot with this whakatauki at the moment about our past informs our future, ngā muri, ngā mua. Not to say that the past is always glossy, but also that we shouldn't just abandon it and not learn from it. And so for me, you know, it's really sad not to have Martin here and not to be, you know, teaching that paper with him and continuing to work with him and having him on my kind of cool people I'd like to supervise with one day list. But there's lots of learning for me from the time that I've spent as a colleague of Martin's, and I think for all of us as a group, I think there's a lot we can learn, and I hope that we are able to, as others have said, kind of continue this work in New Zealand and beyond. Thank you.
Kia ora, Katrina. Thank you very much. Let me introduce Dr. Marta Estellés, who will also join the conversation on her recent work with Martin.
Kia ora, Pablo. Kia ora koutou. I feel a little bit like Katrina said that, you know, I don't have the same kind of authority of other people in this room to talk about Martin's work, because I only met him a couple of years ago, but it's been a very short time, but enough to get a feel of, you know, his generous soul, his modesty, his wisdom, and his deep commitment to education. I had the pleasure to have him as my research mentor when I started at this position at the University of Waikato. And also I took over one of the papers that he used to teach on the history of neoliberalism in New Zealand education. And in one of the meetings that we had to talk about this paper, I will never forget it, because, you know, we met at his office and he had all these big piles of books on the table. And in the middle, he had, of course, the Brian Picot report and the Tomorrow's Schools Reform. And then he started to, you know, talk about, I went through all the books that were on the piles, and he started to explain them all to me. And one of the piles was about, you know, the context of the reform. The other one was 1 decade after the reform. The second pile was about the second decade after the reform, and then some more recent developments afterwards. And, you know, so many of the books were, of course, his books. So, you know, at the beginning, I felt quite intimidated by all the books that were in there and all the things that I had to learn. But, you know, during all this past year that I've been embarking myself of reading all these books, that has given me a much better understanding, not only of, you know, the New Zealand education policy, the history of our recent history of New Zealand education policy, but also of the breadth and depth of Martin's work. And I would like to highlight here just a few characteristics of his work that I really, really appreciate. So the first one is the criticality of his work. I think everyone in this room agrees that Martin was a critical scholar. He didn't like easy answers and even less self-congratulatory attitudes. He was very critical of national policies, but also he was very critical of labor policies as well. And his neoliberalism with social conscience, as he used to call it. And he had a very sharp sense to question common health assumptions and to distinguish between soundbite politics or policies and those more hidden patterns that happen in the background, like privatization, politics of blame, middle class strategies of positional advantage and things like that. And I feel that with his cautionary notes, he was always asking questions like, where do these policies come from? You know, what are they silencing? Who are benefiting from them? What are the effects, and so on. So yeah, I think he really had a very healthy and inspiring skepticism. The other characteristic of Martin's work that I really admired, and I guess is somehow connected to the previous, is his intellectual rigor, his close attention to detail, which is something that other speakers have also mentioned. And I think it was, you know, this rigor that brought him to look at policies beyond good intentions. I heard quite a few times this idea that, you know, policies are wrapped up in beautiful words, but the evil is always in the detail. So that importance of looking at the details, and I think also that rigor brought him to analyze the context, always the socio-political context where policy is enacted, not implemented. I learned that very well from him. And also to analyze that interplay between global currents and local conditions as well. So, of course, you know, the OECD and PISA are very influential, but he knew that any meticulous study should always take into account the confluence of those global currents with vernacular conditions. And the third characteristic of Martin's work that I wanted to highlight here is, of course, its political commitment. The political commitment to, in particular, show to the public the effects of neoliberalism in New Zealand education, but also, I think, more generally, to dismantle the myth of New Zealand as a classless society, and the myth of education as an entity, you know, isolated from social and political struggles. And he had this political commitment, I think, even though it often implied swimming against the current. He warned me a couple of times that in New Zealand it's very difficult to get funds and therefore do research in any issue that is not politically on message. And his research was clearly not. And I'd say that's partly what also motivated him to search for allies outside of New Zealand. But I think what is so commendable of his work is that despite this, he did not give up and continue researching on how education policies contributed to the reproduction of economic inequalities and the undermining of public education. And, you know, after reading, you know, a few books of him, most of his work, I think I have the impression that he also did his research swimming against the current because of another reason. And I'm talking about to the rise of what Nancy Fraser calls progressive neoliberalism. So the co-optation of by neoliberalism of social justice calls, in particular politics of recognition, and the displacement of politics of economic redistribution. So yes, I think Martin's work was untimely in many senses, but perhaps because of that, it was so crucially necessary. Anyway, on the day that Martin gave me these books, it was a very sad day because, you know, he was already quite sick and I knew he was saying goodbye. But after reading all of them, I understand that this work is staying here with us. And, you know, we have to keep it alive. That's our complex hope, and that's my complex hope at the moment. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Good, Marta, thank you very much. Let me now invite Dr. Megan Smith. The floor is yours, Megan.
Okay, unmuted. Thank you for inviting me along to speak somewhat of my experience with Martin as my chief supervisor And I've decided to use some slides to keep me on track, and I hope it doesn't bring down from the conversational vibe that has existed so far. But let me start by saying that one of the core aspects of Martin's work that drew me to him for the role of Chief Supervisor was the way that he critically considered the relevance of context in educational policy. And this has been raised by several already. So let me explore a little of that with you now. Sorry, I have to get that back. Martin described his definition of context as narrower than other prominent scholars because he emphasised the following elements. First and most important, his distinction was that of contextual factors were those that were beyond the control of staff. So, for example, the factors that, while school-based, were not school-caused, leaving staff only able to respond to rather than directly change. So those external factors might include characteristics of the student intake, looking at things like class and ethnicity, but proportions of particular needs or backgrounds as well. In addition, the characteristics of the school and the area were of importance. So its location, perhaps its relationship with surrounding schools. Martin's definition also encompassed factors internal to the school, such as the historical context of past leadership, resourcing, and reputation. Looking at context in policy and practice, in policy writing, Martin talked about downplaying external factors like socioeconomic status or social context, how that fit a managerialist policy approach of where efficiency was the focus and organisational strategies and professional managers were very much a part of the solution. This approach, of course, aligned with the neoliberal reforms of the 1980s, ones that continue to impact us today. He also, policy also often assumes context is unimportant, or it leaves school-based policy actors to mediate what policy expects with what they believe their school can actually deliver. And within policy is often broadly articulated, leaving context as a local concern, and this approach might be considered particularly evident in policy produced for the self-managing school system that we have here in Aotearoa. And this is where context intersects with policy enactment. In policy enactment, school-based resolution of contextual factors might generate positive or negative consequences because, of course, it is constrained or enabled by the external contextual factors that Martin chose to highlight as being the least under the influence of school staff. The enactment of policy that doesn't already address contextual matters runs the risk of also being missed or unaddressed at the level of the school. So where the staff may not recognise their agency to effect change or have become blind to the contextual issues that hide in plain sight. And this is where my own research took off, or one aspect of it. And following Martin, I sought to understand the contextual factors in order for school-based policy actors to speak truth to power and to recognise their agency in response to those factors. So for my own purposes, context captures a broad range of factors, drawing attention to both those that can be changed and those that cannot. It aims to promote action in response to factors where the possession of agency and the option of action may have become concealed or forgotten. And we've talked before about the myriad of pressures that exists on schools and teachers. As a result, school actors can become stuck in their responses to some issues, or may simply no longer see them due to the constraints on their time and resources. One aspect of my research focused on a very tangible context, the built space of a primary school, which I examined in relation to parental engagement. And I wanted to know how parental engagement policy considered this material context and what impact it had on the enactment of this policy in school. Staff readings of the school's built space was that it had either positive or neutral impact on their enactment of parental engagement, as indicated by the quotes to the left. However, a couple of staff members saw how the built space constrained engagement with parents, and despite feeling this constraint, Bridget, the example here, showed how users were not just shaped by space, but they also have agency to act on built spaces, modifying them, rejecting their intended uses, and so on. But overall, staff tended not to see themselves as actors with agency to address space outside of their classrooms, viewing it as largely immutable, hard architecture, and therefore there's not much we can do about it. And while these are a little difficult to see in, through this context, through the Zoom, mental mapping was used to capture parents' experiences of the school's built space. And the two maps I've chosen here illustrate how differently individuals can experience the same built environment. And it shows how their personal contexts impact those experiences, with one parent having a child in the senior area of the school. And while she's been there for 5 years, has very little engagement with the built space of the school. The second parent, whose map is on the left, has been involved in for a similar length of time with the school, with 2 children in the junior years, but is also a PTA member and the school Facebook page coordinator. And her engagement with the school built space has expanded significantly and showed much more confidence in moving around that space. Through our respective research, Martin and I found that school-based actors can become stuck in context, no longer able to see contextual factors at play, or sometimes the possibility for action. Part of the role of research can be to make the familiar strange, such as I did in bringing staff to consider the built space of their school. Through this process of making the familiar strange, there are opportunities to push back against the politics of blame, or to uncover agency where previously none was recognised. Identifying and recognising all the contextual factors acting on schools and at play within them can quickly become overwhelming. Through Martin's earlier work with Ruth Lupton, they suggest responses can be developed on a middle ground of sorts where there are some core shared characteristics. And context remains important. Just in the last few weeks, news stories have captured the impact of a government review on 350 school building projects, and stories of leaking classrooms and mushrooms growing on walls in some schools have highlighted the incredibly varied reality of schooling in Aotearoa, and how the key issues develop from external contexts beyond the control of the school. So I've briefly touched on Martin's concern with context in educational policy settings. And while I've shown one way in which I drew on this in my own work, it does not capture the many valuable discussions that we had over the course of my PhD research. and continues to influence me and my work. Kia ora.
Good, Megan. Let me then invite Jade Rother, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Waikato and whose thesis was also supervised by Martin Thrupp.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you for the introduction, Pablo. It's my absolute privilege to be here presenting and sharing Martin's wonderful work and his legacy, and talking particularly about the impact that he had on me as a doctoral student, and like Megan has already talked, how his work has shaped my ideas and my ways of seeing the world. So as all of you are very aware, Martin dedicated much of his work to exploring systematic inequalities in education, specifically how schooling tends to advantage some children, but also disadvantage others. He was quick to acknowledge that teaching and learning are influenced by numerous factors, many of which can't necessarily be solved by teachers alone. One significant factor that Martin continued to highlight throughout his work was this role of social class, specifically the hierarchical grouping of people based on their accumulated cultural, social, and economic capital. In other words, specific knowledge, practices, skills, advantageous social connections, and economic resources and assets. And by examining the intricacies of social class, Martin's work didn't shy away from the various strategies that the middle class use to advantage their children, and the fact that these strategies are at times even enabled by educational policy. Within his professorial lecture, he discussed the significance of school choice and how middle-class families often shop for the right school. And while we know that school choice has been somewhat restricted by zoning policies, throughout his work, he illustrated that middle-class families have the resources to kind of get a backdoor entrance to schools, whether that's having the resources to purchase a home to ensure that their child secured entry and they would be in zone, a concept that he coined selection by mortgage. He also discussed there were specific things that the middle class searched for in schooling. They tended to look for popular schools, ones that were well-resourced, and specifically ones that were populated by other white middle-class families. And we know that there's a well-established relationship between socioeconomic status and achievement. And so it's likely that those schools had higher levels of achievement. And based on some of his previous work, that teachers were commonly able to dedicate more time to teaching and learning, not having to manage the same levels of disruptive behaviour that might have been present in a working class school. It's also likely that these children will develop a specific type of knowledge and skills that would create a social network that may provide access to future education or employment, and thus actually further advantaging the middle class. So these ideas were really integral to my own research, and what I was looking at specifically was around access to music education in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the reason for this is that music education tends to be a subject that is prohibitively expensive, and therefore not every single child gets access to it, despite being one of the requirements of the New Zealand curriculum. And so in my research, I looked at 3 different public, primary and intermediate schools. And similar to Martin's work, I discovered that middle-class families have very different values and aspirations for their children. And they commonly viewed this idea of success through economic outputs, as in, will my child be able to purchase their own home? In comparison, working class families focused on the health and well-being of their children, making comments like, "I hope my child doesn't end up pregnant." It was interesting as well that these families looked at school choice so differently, that the middle class spent a significant amount of time, resources, and energy trying to find the right school for their child, while the working class tended to give very little thought to school choice, not even really considering that that was an option. And so I started to look at the institutional habitus of these schools, and I found that this tended to reflect the aspirations of the communities that they served. So I saw that achievement in numeracy and literacy was prioritised in all 3 schools. And at the more affluent school, this was a larger focus, which resulted in subjects such as music being largely omitted or pushed to the end of the school day when children were tired and unfocused, something that Martin discovered in his work throughout analysing the impact of national standards. But I also saw that the middle class tended to pursue music through extracurricular activities. But despite this affluent school, even though there wasn't a lot of music education happening within it, it was very well positioned for music making. It had a dedicated music room, it had this room filled to the brim with different resources. And this was simply a result of fundraising initiatives and the community's ability to financially contribute towards the school. The other 2 schools I looked at, numeracy and literacy was also prioritised, but being intermediates, there was a greater emphasis placed overall on offering a broad curriculum. Culture was also really important to these 2 schools, and as a result, it was often promoted, cultural music making, during school events. The problem, though, that this type of knowledge isn't necessarily or universally valued in New Zealand's education system, and that the skills from cultural music making are unlikely to translate into the skills that children need to succeed in music in secondary and tertiary levels. And it doesn't necessarily develop the cultural capital that's valued by the dominant class. What was really interesting was that I then had a look into the different types of extracurricular activities. And what I found was that middle class children participated in a wide variety of extracurricular activities. They were pursued strategically, and there were numerous activities. They often happened after school and they were back to back. There was a preference for kind of high culture activities, particularly instrumental music making, with a preference being given to classical instruments. One parent even shared that they had enrolled their child in private instrumental tuition from the age of 6, simply because that they wanted their child to attend an exclusive private secondary school. And in that secondary school, it was compulsory for all students to learn an instrument. And so their understanding was, well, if I start my child early, they'll be advantaged by the time that they get to secondary school. And this was at the age of 6. They also talked about developing their child's curriculum vitae, and that it was important for their child to be able to demonstrate they had a work ethic and the ability to stick with a task. And we also know that there's this well-established relationship between music and cognitive function. And this came out really clearly, that parents pursued music education, will enroll their children in music education to enhance the cognitive function of their child. Even discussing when they were pregnant that they would commonly play classical composers such as Mozart to enhance brain development. In contrast, the working class participated in far fewer activities, and these were normally dictated by cost and also constrained by transport. When children of the working class did participate in these activities, it tended to be because they were initiated by the child themselves, rather than the parent pursuing them, which might not have had a lot of input from the child themselves. What was also interesting was that the types of music making was very different between the social classes. With a working class, music making tend to be very informal, happening at home with a guitar. Cultural practices were promoted, and access to instruments was really huge, with guitar and ukulele being prioritized over classical instruments such as a piano that's very expensive and difficult to maintain. Alongside access to these different opportunities, class also impacted children's ability to be successful in music. Middle-class parents had typically been involved in music themselves and had an understanding, and therefore were able to encourage a regular practice routine for their child. They were very engaged and supported in the process. They had access to instruments and resources, and they also had access to space, so the physical space where the children could practice. In contrast to this, working class parents seem to be less involved in their child's education. And while we might think, well, in isolation, that might suggest that working class parents simply didn't value education, but as we all know, this wasn't necessarily the case. It was more a reflection of the work schedules and the added responsibilities of looking after younger children. Working class children didn't have the same opportunities to practice, particularly a lot of them didn't even have access to the instrument that they were learning at home. They were additionally limited by spaces and other resources that might have been required to practice, so a music stand or an amplifier for a guitar. And so what I found through this research is that music education continues to be used by the middle class alongside many other strategies that Martin's work discusses to positionally advantage their children. And my study, it resulted in the middle class receiving greater access to music education, both within the classroom and through extracurricular activities. These children were more likely to celebrate success, develop knowledge and skills needed to succeed in education, suggesting that children, through no fault of their own, did not receive equal access to the curriculum, nor the opportunity to develop the same set of skills. These findings reinforce Martin's notion that middle-class advantage is persistent. It provides accumulative advantages across a range of areas. And while almost 20 years have passed since Martin's professorial lecture, it seems that social class continues to be education's inconvenient truth, a context that's commonly ignored, disregarded, or even dismissed as deficit theorizing. Despite potential pushback, as researchers, we need to collectively embrace Martin's steadfast commitment to social justice, even when doing so might be uncomfortable, unpopular, or even conflict with our own self-interests. This is part of the legacy that Martin has left, a legacy that will not be forgotten and that will continue for many generations to come. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much. So the floor is open now for further conversation, and I just read Judy Ellison mentioned that she'd like to talk about Martin's work with the teacher union. So thank you very much, Judy.
Yes, hi, can everybody hear me? Yeah. I just want to give a minute or two to further expand on what was mentioned earlier about Martin's work with the unions. I was a policy advisor at PPTA from 2002 to 2018, and I recall that I was in correspondence with Martin even before he left London to come to his position at Waikato, about whether he would do some research for us. And he agreed immediately, and we were corresponding over the whole period that he was moving, and then he began the work for us, which was amazing, really. So sort of first up we were on his return to New Zealand. The work was about standards, and it was to rebut some work that was being done for the Teachers' Council on professional standards. And it was a team from the Australian Council for Education Research had been hired by the Teachers' Council, and they were producing work that suggested that what New Zealand needed to improve teacher quality was a huge multi-level set of very, very specific standards. And Martin, in the end, the contract was with PPTA and NZEI. So we shared it, and we shared ownership of the research in terms of using it to dissuade the Teachers' Council from following the Australian model. And Martin's report, it was a relatively brief report, but it was well evidenced, as everything that Martin ever did, advocated for a small set of generic standards. And interestingly, much later in the development of the kahui-ako model of school collaborations, there was to be a set of standards written for the teachers who were in positions in kahui-ako. It still says, at least in the PPTA collective agreement, that there will be standards written, but the Ministry of Education hired put together a team of people, which included me, to write those standards. But the first thing we were asked to do was to write some appointment criteria, and the ministry put on to the team an Australian researcher who'd read the ASA report and also had experience with Australian teaching standards, which tend to be much more complex than ours, much more detailed and specific. So Martin's research was waived again as a much better model by myself and the NZEI rep, and in the end, no standards have ever been written for those positions in kahui-ako. The criteria for appointment that we used which are fairly general, have tended to serve as the criteria for appointment. That was the first time that I worked with Martin. There were a few other times over the time I was there, but what I think I recall most is that Martin respected hugely the role of teacher unions in the whole policy making sphere. Education policy making. He didn't think that we would at any stage, and that's probably because he was a Kiwi and he knew the role that teachers unions had, but he never assumed that teachers unions were only about negotiating collective agreements. He had utter respect for our role in influencing education policy. So I loved working with Martin. It was a huge pleasure at all times, and I'm so sad to see him gone. Thanks, Pablo, for the time.
Yeah. The floor is open for anyone to speak, really. So I really encourage you all to share any stories or ideas that might resonate. Well, in the meantime, I might raise a question to the speakers, or to everyone actually, but especially to the speakers about, in a way, my concern is about how to continue these conversations and And yes, so that's basically the question. I'm wondering about, in a way, what kinds of conversations, but also about what continuing the conversation with Martin Thrupp entails in terms of the gesture or the style or the politics even of that conversation. Yes, so especially to the speakers, but also if anyone else would like to contribute, does this provoke any thought?
Could I comment that I think a really key actor in there is probably the NZARE policy special interest group, and we really need to up our game. Martin was a really important part of that group and one of our most prominent policy researchers. And we do have a pattern of meeting every year as a special interest group. And I know that Tom Haig, who's on the call here, and I've been talking about, and Huidan, who's, I don't see her on the call, have been talking about a seminar this year that Tom's been working on, and I think it's going to be a great acknowledgement, if you like, of Martin's legacy, in that it's you know, taking a creative look. So Tom might like to talk briefly about it, perhaps, but he might want to keep his powder dry. So I'll leave it to him.
Oh, thanks, Judy. Yeah, I'll sort of hold fire on that one, but yeah, certainly I think you're right that the you know, Martin's legacy with the NZARE and the policy seg in particular is, you know, hugely to be acknowledged. I was just going to write a sort of small reflection in the comments, but seeing as you passed the floor to me, my first interaction with Martin was maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and I got in touch with his colleagues at Waikato to ask about support for the charter schools campaign at PPDA, and they all said, "Oh no, the person you really have to talk to is Martin, and we'll take his lead on how we respond to this." Yeah, the respect he was held in was so evident, and yeah, I think, you know, as the conversation has shown today, entirely deserved. So yeah, look forward to that event, and we'll let everybody on the call know about that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
John, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Pablo. I was reminded when Marta showed some of those piles of books that she's been given by Martin, you know, that every 10 years or so, Martin was putting together a collection of articles on contemporary policy issues and also what had happened in the intervening 10 years. So if I remember rightly, the last one was published by Wilf Malcolm Centre, and it was around about 2010. I don't think there's been another one since then, so it might be timely rather than untimely to think about another collection. I think the sort of quality of the presentations from Katrina called them younger people on the call, people at earlier stages of their careers, suggest that there's a good opportunity to show the continuity that Martin's enabled through the policy scholarship terrain in Aotearoa. When we talked about the editorship of the last one in 2010, it was agreed that it should be Martin as a senior scholar, but also working with somebody who was, or at least one person who was less experienced. So I'm just going to suggest that maybe there's a conversation to be had either in Wilf Malcolm or in Global Studies that says now is a good time to capture all these thoughts and the collaborations that each of us may have had with Martin, and to come up with something that might be a particularly important statement given the current political temperature. Yeah, kia ora.
Kia ora, John. Thank you very much. We'll definitely take that call and bring it forward. Hugh. Oh, I can't. I think it's
Yeah,
muted. Yeah.
I'm okay. Yeah, just to pick up on what John said there, I've thought for some time actually, I mean, I say some time, a few weeks, I've had a discussion with Pablo about whether the New Zealand Journal of Educational Studies would actually produce a special issue on Martin and the themes that have been raised tonight. But I was reminded of the temperature rising, John, by some remarks that Joanna Kidman at Victoria made the other day. And I thought that it's probably a timely time to actually write more about what's happening, because it looks like there's a kind of total backtracking from where I'm standing or sitting over the other side of the world in terms of a lot of educational progress that was made. It's being unraveled, and maybe it's time for something a bit more kind of fiery in the nicest possible way to be written.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you very much. So we can continue the conversation. I'm also conscious of the time, and I let me acknowledge that some of you may be busy and might have to leave. So let me just briefly basically thank the speakers, thank everyone who has joined, well, I think this on my side, it's felt a powerful event. So special thanks to everyone, and a great honor to host it. So let us continue the conversations. I just thought I'd mention this to finish, to thank, and the room is still open to continue. Michelle, I saw that you had your hand up. Would you like to? Was that a hand up or not really?
Pablo, it was
Sorry.
applause.
Oh, sorry.
Applause for the seminar this morning and the